Hello ladies and gentlemen. This is the second part of a two-parter that deals with the two knights variation in the Caro. This video will be about the move knight to e2. In the last video we analyzed the moves d4 and bishop e2. Knight e2 is the main move and the most critical move. It leads to very fresh positions where black often sacrifices a pawn for active play. Black goes queen b6, d4, e6, and here white is at a crossroads. There are two moves, knight fg1, which is the main move, and knight g3. Knight g3 makes a lot of sense, because it prepares to activate the bishop, most likely to d3. Black immediately strikes in the center. This type of position is reminiscent of the French defense. The bishop is on c8, we did not succeed in developing our bishop, and the whole structure with c5, d5, e6 is very typical of a French defense. In this position, white has two moves. He can either play c3, which is very stable, supporting the e4 pawn, or bishop d3. After c3, knight c6, bishop d3, we take on g3, takes, we take on d4, bishop d7, king f1, bishop e7, and after g4, we can play knight to b4. In general, black is very happy to trade off the bishop on d3. White's pawns are on dark squares, e5 and d5. Pardon me, e5 and d4. For that reason, the bishop on d3 is white's good bishop. And white generally would like to maintain this bishop. White takes on h7. We take, bishop takes, and g6. And after king g1, rook c8, we have a position where black is a pawn down. However, the bishop on h7 is completely cut off, and it's not clear how this bishop will ever come back into play again. For now, there are many light-squared weaknesses, especially on c2 and on d3. Black can try and jump in on c2 with either knight or the rook. The bishop on d7 will come to b5. And then there might also be moves like bishop d3 or knight to d3. Black has full compensation for the pawn, and it is not unlikely that white will lose this bishop on h7 at some point. According to the engine, the position is around equal, but I would rather be black. To me, it is not clear what white will do now. Black's position is completely fine. If white plays 8 bishop d3, we take on g3, h takes, c takes d4. Here white has a couple of moves. Let's see what happens after knight takes d4. Of course, we do not take on d4. This is a common motive in the French. After bishop b5 check, black would lose his queen. Instead, we play the move bishop c5. White has two moves, either c3 or knight b5. Knight b5 is connected with a pawn sacrifice. After bishop d7, knight d6, takes, takes, queen g4, king f8, bishop d2, knight c6, long castle, e5, queen h5, bishop e6. We have a position where black is a pawn up. His king on f8 is slightly weakened. However, the center, the pawns on d5 and e5 are very strong, and they protect the king on f8. It's not easy for white to open up the position. After f4, black might consider pushing e4, keeping the position closed. White does have certain compensation for the sacrificed pawn, but it's not clear how white wants to continue. I really like black's position and I would choose material over the activity. Then there is the move g4 on move 10. Black plays knight c6, and after a3 there is the interesting idea to play g6. It might seem like black is weakening all his dark squares, but the point is simple. Black wants to play bishop g7, targeting the e5 pawn. Black might play queen c7 afterwards, attacking the pawn yet again. It's not easy for white to defend this pawn. And black is currently a pawn up. We have taken on d4, white has not recaptured as yet. So black is a pawn up, and I would already say that black is slightly better. What's left is the move 10 knight g5. Knight c6 and knight takes h7. White is greedy, he takes the pawn and he is threatening to go knight f6 with check and discovered attack on the rook. There's nothing black can do about this. We play bishop d7, knight f6, otherwise black just castles. We take rook h8, long castle, king f1 and f takes e5. Black is an exchange down, but for this exchange black has got one pawn and a very mobile pawn center, e6, e5, d5 and d4. Black might consider pushing e5 to e4. Black is already fully developed, he has castled, his pieces are nicely placed. White's pieces are completely scattered. There is no coordination, the rook on h8 is active, but it doesn't do that much. White's rook on a1 and bishop on c1 aren't activated as yet. The bishop cannot really move because the b2 pawn would be hanging, and black has full compensation for the sacrificed material. There was one game in this position, and black went on to win. I think that the position is around equal, but I would rather be black. This is about it. Let's come to the main move, knight f to g1. Black goes f6. The point of knight f to g1 is to play f2 to f3. Black's knight has no square to retreat and would be lost. f6 is kind of forced. f3, knight g5, ef, gf, f4, knight f7 and knight f3. And this is an important position. Originally I thought that white is to be preferred here, because none of the theoretical moves, bishop e7, bishop g7 or knight d7, convince me. I think that white keeps the upper hand after any of them, and also I think the position is easier to play with white. Then there was a point when I got lucky and I found this Travai, the move e5. And this move changes everything. Black immediately strikes in the center and white needs to react. There are many moves white can try. For example c3, d takes e or f takes e. Let's start with the move c3. White tries to stabilize his center, but he cannot only not fight for an advantage with this move, black is already for choice. e4, knight h4, c5. Black must undermine the center right away. White has two moves, d takes c5 and queen b3. After queen b3 we play f5. And now bishop e3 would run into c4. When after queen c2 there's bishop e7 hitting the knight on h4. Bishop f2 and knight d6. And black is already much better. If d takes c5, bishop c5, queen takes d5, we give a check, king d1 and castle. And this position is also already better for black, because rook to d8 is on the cards and the king on d1 is very weak. Let's check the move d takes e5. Black takes, white takes, and bishop g7. White has two moves in this position, either knight takes f7 or knight to d3. After knight takes f7, we take it back, queen d3, knight d7, queen b3. It is mandatory to trade off the queen, because black has a very dangerous initiative. Rook e8, queen b6, a b6, king f2, walking out of the pin, and knight c5. Even though the queens have come off the board, black still has wonderful compensation for the sacrificed pawn. He is exerting very nice pressure along the a file, along the e file, the bishop on g7 is a real powerhouse, and the knight on c5 is very strong as well. Black might give a check on e4 whenever he feels like it. Also knight a4 is possible, hitting the b2 pawn. White has a very ugly position. His two bishops and his two rooks are still on the back rank, the king on f2 is weak, and the knight on e2 also doesn't make all that much sense. Black does not only have full compensation, black is already a bit better. Let's check the move knight d3. After knight d3, black castles. Knight g3, check, bishop e2, bishop g4, king f1, we take, and play c5. And once again, it is very obvious that black has very good compensation. All his pieces are active, the knight will come to c6, enhancing the pressure on white. The king on f1 is very weak and misplaced, the pieces are not ideally coordinated, and we can also push c4, after which the knight on d3, white's only good piece, would have to retreat. Let's check the main move. F takes e5. F takes. White has a couple of options here. White can play knight g3, knight takes e5, or d takes e5. Let's start with knight g3. Black has tried a couple of moves in this position, but none of them really convinced me. I think the best move in this position is bishop e6. What is the idea behind bishop e6? The idea of bishop e6 is to play knight d7 and castle. White takes on e5, bishop c5, knight h5, bishop check, king e2, knight d7, knight g7, king e7. Here Santosh Vidit came up with the idea a4, and he's pretty optimistic about White's chances. However, after bishop c5, I couldn't find a way for White to achieve any sort of advantage. After a5 there is queen b4 when black is completely fine. And after queen e1, it is important to take on e5 with the knight. With the knight on d7, that is. Here again a5 is answered or is met with queen b4, after which is fine. After which black is fine. And after queen h4 check, we play king d7. Knight takes e6, king takes, and after g3 we can simply play king d7. It is strange that black is moving his king all over the board, but there is no problem. Black will follow up with rook a e8 pretty soon and asks the white king what it is actually doing in the center. Black is fine and bishop h3 is not a problem. If instead of a4, white takes on e6, we get a really funny position, with kings on e6 and kings on e2. Personally, I have never seen such a position where the kings are both so stuck in the center. Black's plan is clear. He will play rook e8 and he will take on e5. The position is double-edged and very unclear, but personally I think that black is fine. We have a plan and no objective problem in this position. The main move, however, is f takes e. F takes, and now d takes. Bishop g7, and white has two moves. In the game Bacrot versus Shabalov, white played c3, castle, queen d4. And instead of knight b to d7, which was played by Shabalov, I recommend the move rook e8. Knight b to d7 is still not bad for black. It is a very playable position around equality. Black has no problems, but he got outplayed later on. After rook fe8, black is ready for choice. The pawn on e5 will drop, and all black's forces are very active. If white takes on b6, we also get the open A file to operate with. White goes queen d4, and now black has two moves. There's nothing particularly wrong with castles, but I recommend the move knight takes e5. After knight takes, queen takes, knight takes, bishop e5, bishop e3, knight d7. It is pretty obvious that black has solved his every problem. He will follow up with knight f6,